Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Alexandra, a solution marketer here at Perficient, and I'm excited to be moderating today's webinar. We're going to be talking about getting past the hype of blockchain to the real meat of adoption and how to get started. We're recording today's session, and we'll be emailing you afterwards with information on how to access that recording and the slides. Time permitting, we'll also be answering questions at the end of the presentation, so please type those into the chat box at any time during the webinar. We'll also be asking some polling questions, so look out for those during the session and please answer them as they come up. We'd love to hear from you too and get a better sense of who's out there on the call. In a moment, I'll hand it over to our speaker, but first, let me give you a quick overview of Perficient. Perficient is the leading digital transformation consulting firm serving enterprise customers in North America. Perficient and our agency deliver business optimization, digital experience, and industry solutions. Founded in 1997, we're a public company with more than 3,000 employees. We've formed strategic partnerships with all of the major technology vendors, also have dedicated solution and industry practices. And now I'd like to introduce our wonderful speaker for today, Naveen Sachdeva. Naveen is the Solution Director for Perficient's blockchain practice and has 24 years of experience in software development and delivery. He's written many articles, co-authored books, and even holds a patent in business rules management. And now before I hand it over to Naveen, we'd love to hear a little bit about all of you and what you're most interested in learning during today's webinar. So please take a look at the first polling question we have. And what are you most interested in learning about today? Is it just, what is blockchain? Why should you adopt it, and what are the benefits? What are some key industry use cases? How can you get started? And what are some of the best practices? So please take a look at that and give us your response. We'd love to know where you most want to focus today. Looks like we have some good results coming in. A lot of people interested in use cases today. So I would say the majority of people look like they're interested in use cases. Get in any last responses here and I'll close the poll and hand it over to Naveen. All right, so in terms of results, it looks like over half of you are really interested in hearing about those use cases, which is great. That's a lot of what we're going to be focusing on today. And at this point, I will hand it over to Naveen.
Thanks, Alexandra. Hello, everyone. So I hope by now you're already aware a little bit about blockchain and heard the hype about it as to how it's going to replace all the banks and the Bitcoin will become the currency of the world, and how blockchain is going to replace Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and all the 800 so ICOs that are out there. So today we are not going to be talking about that. We are going to be talking more about what's really happening in the industry, more business-to-business kind of scenarios. And before we go there, just to level set what is blockchain. Again, as I said, I'm assuming you guys know, but just to give a perspective, and from three different perspectives, first being the business perspective. Now, from a business perspective, blockchain is about business-to-business interactions or transfer value, and doesn't actually have to be business-to-business. It could be business to users, business to devices. As we see currently happening, there are some use cases in the automotive industry where people are talking about how the autonomous cars are going to be interacting with blockchain, or in a supply chain, how the various containers might interact with blockchain. So from a business perspective, it's all about those transactions and the transfer of value between the participants in blockchain. From the technical perspective, blockchain is basically a distributed ledger. So it's a copy of the transaction ledger that is same across multiple participants. And there's a consensus that makes sure that all the transactions are same. There are different implementations. In some, you basically execute all the transactions on all the participants. In other, you execute them only on some but validate them all. But technically speaking, it's basically a distributed ledger that is kept in sync. easiest analogy, one can think of it as a distributed database with a decentralized control. In other words, a database which is distributed across participants with the same copy, except no one participant essentially owns it. The third perspective is a legal perspective, or you can think of it as an audit perspective, which basically looks at blockchain as a validated, indisputable transaction ledger, so you know who did what when, and everybody can see the same transactions, of course, with the privacy constraints that could be applied on the blockchain. Another legal aspect to the blockchain is the smart contract aspect, so the logic that is getting executed. And legal aspect being there that all the parties agree that under what conditions, what is going to happen. So that's a kind of a legal contract. But since it's a code, there is still a separation between the two, but there is some work going on to bridge that gap. And if you're specifically interested in that, I suggest that you look up a CORD project, which is looking specifically into that boundary between the legal and the smart contract. Basic about blockchain characteristics, so the idea that it's a transaction ledger that is immutable, so you can only append those transactions. Since you see all the transactions, it is traceable. You can see when a particular transaction happened, who did it, to a certain extent. And of course, we talk about smart contract, the consensus being there, and the whole thing being secure using the cryptography, which uses the keys to make the thing secure, as well as all the transaction that is happening. But the key blockchain characteristic is the fact that it's decentralized control. That is the one which distinguishes it from the other existing technologies. So whenever you see this particular characteristic being broken, you know that either it's a variation, so there are some variations of blockchain where some of the control is still centralized, so it is not pure blockchain, but main characteristics of the blockchain that you're looking for is the fact that it's a decentralized control so no single participant essentially owns it. Now, what are the benefits? And then this goes, you probably all have heard about it. Okay, so what's the big deal? The big deal is that if you have such a transaction ledger and a transparency, what that does is it disintermediates some of the parties in the ecosystem who are just keeping track of transactions or doing dispute management across the participants, because now if you have the indisputable, immutable, traceable transaction ledger with a smart contract with consensus across all the participants, you don't need those parties. The other thing that happens is that it happens in real time. So there's a huge savings in time because now you can reconcile the things within minutes. You reduces cost by taking those intermediaries out. Also reduces the risk because now since you can see all the transactions, you have transparency that leads to mitigation of the risk as well as the increased trust and the traceability across the value chain. So this is very important specifically when you're looking at supply chain. The saving of the time and cost reduction, that is really huge in finance world because there the time essentially is money, and then that's the reason why this whole thing started from the financial industry. Within blockchain, there are two kinds of blockchain. So again, as I said earlier, there's lots of hype about cryptocurrencies, ICOs, Bitcoin, Ethereum. They all fall into what is known as public blockchain. And in public blockchain, essentially anyone can participate. On the other hand, you have permission blockchains, which is much more controlled, so participation is more by invitation only. There is a predefined trust in permission blockchain as compared to a public blockchain where the blockchain needs to establish that trust, because now you could have participants which might to game the system, for example. So the idea is, how do you prevent those participants from achieving that. So consensus algorithms in public versus permission blockchain is different. As an example, in Bitcoin or Ethereum, you have this what is called proof of work, and the energy that is needed to do that kind of a consensus is huge, and as the network increases, so does the need for energy consumption. Compared to that, in a permission blockchain, since there is already a pre-built sort of a trust, you can use some other consensus algorithms that are not as energy extensive. Also, about governance. So in case of public blockchain, anybody can do anything. So like you see with ICOs, anybody can issue their ICOs, anybody can issue their smart contract, versus in a permissioned or more B2B kind of blockchain, it is much more governed. So there is a well-defined governance process as to who can make changes to the code, what kind of consensus needs to be established before a new member can join the network, and so on and so forth. So these are some of the distinctions, and if you're interested more, we can talk about this later. Now with that, let's get into the use cases, since that is the most of you interested in. And before I go into use cases, as far as the slide is concerned, I have few key industries that I have the use cases about. But if you want to hear about some other use cases, I can also talk about that. So with that, let me ask you as to what are the industries that you are in and would like to see the corresponding use cases. Alexandra?
Yeah, so we have another poll here, so please take a look at that. We have a couple of industries lined up here: automotive, energy and utilities, financial services and insurance, healthcare and life sciences, manufacturing and retail. And of course, there's always more that we can't list out here, but please fill out what you can. We'd love to hear from you and make sure that we're covering the industries that you guys are most represented in. We'll just take a minute to let people respond. It looks like we have a lot of people on the phone in healthcare, which is great. We're definitely going to be covering a lot of use cases there, and a lot of people in others. So I mean, if there are particular ones you really want us to cover, just use the chat window in the lower left-hand corner of your screen and throw those in so that we know what you want to hear about that isn't here in this list. So at this point, I get in any last responses here, and I will close the poll and hand it back over to Naveen. So in terms of final responses, again, it looks like we have a great chunk of people here from healthcare and life sciences, a lot of people in the financial services and insurance industry, and then a huge chunk of people in other. So let us know where in other you are, so we can talk about some of those use cases as well. Thanks. Over to you, Naveen.
Thank you, Alexandra. So it's not surprising that financial services and healthcare is at the top of the list. As you said, this whole conversation about the blockchain started with financial services, and that happens to be the most mature industry as far as the blockchain or permission blockchain is concerned. And there are lots of use cases in that, and you probably would have heard about that in bank-to-bank transaction, cross-border payments, bank guarantees, trade finance. The couple of ones that I want to dive deep into, one of my favorite, which is Project Ubin. This project is led by Mass Monetary Authority of Singapore with R3 Banking Consortium in 2016. And their phase one objective was to see if they can essentially do the real-time settlement transactions onto the blockchain. And in order to do that, they of course wanted to see if they can convert the real currency, fiat currency, into a digital currency. So that was the inherent objective of phase one. And what they found that yes, it is possible. So they were able to move the money from the current accounts of the bank, just keeping the minimum out there, and move everything into the blockchain account where the bank and bank transaction could happen. They could settle the transactions, and at the end of the day, move the money back into the current accounts of the bank. So they were able to achieve that. So the first phase was successful. In 2017, they executed phase 2, and this time their focus was more technologies. So in phase 2, they looked at R3 Corda, Ethereum Quorum, as well as Hyperledger Fabric, and they looked at those technologies from privacy perspective, as well as the gridlock resolutions, which essentially happens when, let's say, Bank A owns money to Bank B, and Bank B owns money to Bank C, and in turn, Bank C owns money back to Bank A. So this generally happens with the bank settlement, and they wanted to see if using smart contract it is possible to do that grid resolution automatically. So that phase was also very successful. So they concluded that all the 3 technologies met their criteria. They also critiqued the 3 technologies. So if you're interested, because I personally found that very interesting, the critique that they gave as to what are some of the shortcomings of the technology. They also published the corresponding code. So if you're interested from the technical perspective, I hardly recommend looking up Project Ubin. So in the future phases, they are going to be looking at how they can use the blockchain for cross-border transaction as well as for security settlement. Now the same thing is also being picked up by other banks. You might have heard recently that Bank of England is also looking at blockchain to do the similar RTGS system on blockchain. Another example, and similar to a Monetary Authority of Singapore, which is essentially an intermediary, and they took head-on the blockchain, which, as I mentioned earlier, could potentially disintermediate those intermediaries. One of the other similar intermediaries is DTCC, which is responsible for clearing and settlements of the securities-related transactions. And they currently have the system or transaction information warehouse, which they provide to various participants who can use that for the trade confirmations and look at the various transactions. So they looked at blockchain as to how they can use blockchain for credit swap transactions, and how the smart contracts can be used to do things that should be done if a default does happen. So how the money needs to move, what kind of external services that needs to be employed. So currently, to my knowledge, they are in phase 1. So they are currently executing the blockchain and the existing 2 system in parallel. And soon they will be moving to completely decentralized control. So what instead of becoming a provider of infrastructure and the platform as services, now they will just be moving to a supervisor, the main objective that they have. So they no longer needs to be on the hook to provide the infrastructure. Each participant will have their own node. So these participants will be direct participants in the blockchain and will have control over the network as defined by the consensus. So these are some of the financial services in the banking. There are lots of other ones in reinsurance, in cross-border payments, where Ripple and Stellar are some of the big things that you might have heard about. The second place where you see lots of interesting work going on is in supply chain, which is, again, not surprising, because in supply chain between the buyer and the supplier, buyer and the sender, there are lots of intermediaries involved. Sometimes you are sending something across countries, so it has to go through various ports. That's the use case that IBM is working with MESEC as to how the containers can be tracked across the various ports. It's also getting used for food traceability. That's the big use case that IBM has been talking about with Walmart. There are lots of other use cases in supply chain as to how can you keep track of the fact that a particular thing was kept at a particular temperature. So specifically when you have specialty drugs that needs to be kept at a specific temperature. So if the temperature did go higher than the threshold, then that drug needs to be sent back. So that's where you have the IoT coming into the picture, the smart contract coming into the picture, which can nullify that shipment if such a thing happens. And with that, let's briefly talk a little bit more about the Walmart use case, which is about food traceability. The idea or the first value out of that use case is to identify the source of the contamination. So if there is a contamination right now, it takes Walmart a few days to identify the source. Until that time, they basically cannot sell that particular item. So if the contamination was in poultry, then they basically cannot sell that chicken because they don't know what's the source, because if the source happens to be the processing plant, then there could be a lot more impact versus if it was just a particular farm. Now with blockchain, they have been able to reduce that from days to minutes. And this is just by putting their suppliers on the network. So currently, it's more of a private or centralized blockchain where the entire blockchain network is being run by Walmart, and the other participants essentially are indirect participants. In other words, they use the APIs that are provided by Walmart. But what is now happening is those participants are seeing the value, and they are becoming what is called direct participant. In other words, they are going to have their own blockchain nodes and their own copy of the ledger, and they are going to have their own access control. And in turn, they can bring their suppliers or the related farmers onto the blockchain. So this is how typically a blockchain network would grow. But then you also have another retailers like Kroger joining the network, or some of the other suppliers like McCormick joining the network, and slowly that network starts growing. So it basically becomes a more of a consortium network. And then that's when you actually start seeing the true value of blockchain, because now instead of just being able to see the traceability aspect, now you have a lot more transparency. Now you can start seeing how a particular produce has being produced. In other words, what kind of, whether it uses the sustainable way or whether it uses GMO, what kind of fertilizers does it use, and so on and so forth. And that's what lots of customers are interested in, so they can see clearly as to how organic, if you will, or how sustainable these particular products have been. The other thing, of course, healthcare, and there are lots of use cases in healthcare, whether it comes to claims, so eligibility determinations, claims processing, patient information is actually the biggest one of them. And I want to talk a little bit more about that one, because it's a long-term goal. Putting patient information on blockchain is not trivial. And so whenever you're thinking of blockchain, you have to keep in mind the blockchain doesn't automatically solve the interoperability problem, right? Because if you're going to put any data onto the blockchain, especially in an ecosystem, all the parties have to agree about that data model. And that has been the biggest issue in healthcare already in terms of interoperability. HL7 has been making big headway into that, now especially with SHIR, and now the new TESCA kicking in. So that's still being addressed, and that's actually being addressed at the API level. For me, it's hard to believe that suddenly we will solve the interoperability problem at the data model level by putting all the data onto the blockchain. So that's a good goal, but I think it's going to take a lot of time for us to get there. Now the question is, where do we start then? If that's the case, if it takes so long for lots of people to agree and then build this consortium blockchain networks, is it possible to create some private blockchain networks, maybe as a starting point, like Walmart, or just local? So I think that's possible. So a starting point, for example, for a healthcare system, putting the patient information out there. So instead of putting the entire patient information out there, I think a starting point will be to use blockchain for patient index. That's to me is one of the big pains. So right now, if I go to a hospital and I register myself, if I go to another hospital, even within the same healthcare system, I have to register myself again because the other hospital has no idea where else I have registered or who else my providers might be. And God forbid if I moved across the cities and later on I need my information, the first issue is that the patient itself may not know which provider has its information. So the first problem to be solved is to have this patient index at least where you can keep track to say that, oh, this patient has information on that provider, and if the patient consent is there, so that could also be put on the blockchain, then you can request that information from that other provider, at least for the time being off-chain, in the long term, hopefully on-chain. But even if we can do this on-chain, I think that's a big step forward in solving this problem. And so the three industries that we talked about are financial, supply chain, and healthcare. In the poll, I noticed lots of people were interested in utility. That's actually another big one going on, specifically with this whole idea that each resident could potentially produce energy. So they can have solar panels, and there could be a peer-to-peer transactions happening, so within the microgrid. It further availed by the fact that there is another change going on with respect to storage of energies. With Tesla, the amount of energy that the Tesla battery can store can essentially run a town. So if someone can store all the solar energy that they're producing and then put it onto the battery, then they can sell whenever they want to sell. So that's going to have a huge impact in the utility space where there could be lots of peer-to-peer transactions, I believe, and that would be more of a public blockchain rather than a permission blockchain. And then there are already some work that's being done in New Jersey. So there's a case studies you might have heard about it regarding the microgrid in the Brooklyn area. So I think that's definitely going to happen in the near future. Another cross-industry use case is essentially in asset management, and then this could impact lots of industries: oil and gas, airlines, trains, anything where you have a high-value asset whose life needs to be tracked, or the maintenance and the inspections needs to be tracked because there are regulations out there. And these maintenance and inspections are done by third parties who does not have predefined interfaces with the centralized asset management system. So recently, IBM, which has Maximo as their asset management product, announced this beta program as to how their asset management product can work with such a blockchain solution where the third parties could put their inspection reports onto the blockchain, and regulators or anybody else can essentially have that visibility and see that, yes, the asset. So that's one of the use cases in asset management. As I said, it could impact multiple industries across the board. And with that, let's get into, okay, how do we start it? I just gave a few pointers earlier with respect to private blockchains, but before we go ahead, let's just get a general idea about where you guys are in the journey to blockchain.
Great. So we have our last poll up on the screen. So everybody, please take a look at that. We just want to know, where are you in your blockchain journey? Are you not yet started and still exploring the options? Are you starting to identify use cases to build out? Are you completing a POC, building a prototype, doing a pilot, or already planning to scale? So please take a look at that and let us know where you are. We'd love to hear a little bit more about how mature your blockchain program is currently. So it looks like there are a lot of people who haven't yet started, which is which is common. I think that's true for a lot of organizations who are considering blockchain. It's still a newer technology that people are still understanding. I'll leave the poll open here for a couple more seconds, so get in any last responses, and then close, and we can take a look at results. All right, so it looks like most of the people on the call, about 2/3 of you, have not yet started, and then those of you who have are still early in the process identifying those use cases that you're going to build out. Now I'll hand it back to Naveen.
Thanks, Alexandra. All right, since most of you haven't started, I think it is worthwhile going through this journey in a little bit of detail. Of course, the first step is identifying the use case, and then that is perhaps the most difficult step. And then the reason behind that is blockchain or ideal blockchain use case is across multiple participants. So it is not just internally company focused, it's more about B2B. Typically, especially if you're just looking at your private network as to the ecosystem where you have the direct visibility to, you might already have a solution to the problem. And the challenge though is to seeing, okay, what if I could get more visibility beyond my network, because that's where the value of the blockchain comes in. So for example, if you look at the Walmart use case, the value comes in by knowing not just about their suppliers, but where their suppliers is getting something from, so that they can better identify the source. And as that more information comes on the blockchain, the more values it has. So it's not surprising that it is slightly difficult to identify the first use case, and that's where you need to have the business involved, you need to have the security people involved, and do this collaboratively rather than just do it internally. So that's the biggest hurdle to cross. The rest of the journey by itself is not uncommon. Like if you do any project, you look at the use case, you do POC, prototype, pilot, and then you take it to production. Some of the unique things apart from identifying the right use case for blockchain is like selecting the blockchain platform. So the fact that it is a new technology, platforms are still emerging. There are public blockchains, there are permission blockchains, there are different consensus algorithms. You need to know as to which blockchain platform is right, because each use case might have a different privacy requirements. Each use case might have a different size of the blockchain, so the consensus algorithm becomes important. So that's something unique about this blockchain journey. The other thing that is unique about this blockchain journey is this notion of minimum viable ecosystem. The fact that it is about B2B, in order for a network effect to kick in, or the values that can be derived from the blockchain, you need to know how many partners do you need in this ecosystem for it to be fruitful. And so that is very important, and there's lots of effort that goes in creating that ecosystem. Sometimes a consortium already exists that you can join. In other cases, there is no consortium. And you're basically just looking at a private blockchain. So you're basically talking with your suppliers or partners and getting them onboarded on the idea and finally onto your blockchain, so that all of the participants in the ecosystem, at least in your blockchain network, can see the value from the blockchain. So those are some of the distinguishing aspects. The rest of the journey is not very uncommon than anything new that you want to start with. Now, as I said earlier, identifying the use case is the biggest hurdle. So what makes a good blockchain use case? Again, before you go there, you have to understand what distinguishes blockchain. So if you can solve the problem by using a centralized database, then you know you don't have the right blockchain use case. So there has to be, even if you're looking within, so for example, within a healthcare system, though it is the same network, but the different participants could be autonomous. So they might have their own systems, each one using a different EMR. And that sometimes makes it very difficult to have a centralized database kind of a solution, because each one has its own security, each one has its own EMR, and there is a little bit of trust boundary that you need to cross, and that's where blockchain comes into the picture. Now, if you go beyond that, of course, now you have participants who have their totally different system, different governance boundaries, and for them to agree, they're not going to agree with a centralized solution. Doesn't matter who hosts it, whether even if it is hosted by IBM or Amazon, there are control issues. So the decentralized control aspect of the blockchain, as I mentioned earlier, is the key distinguishing factor. Now, for a use case, apart from the need for a trust or accountability or provenance, there's also the fact that there has to be some business network. Again, if you're a single company trying to do, most likely you can do it with a centralized solution. So there has to be some identifiable business network. And of course, like any use case, there has to be an ROI. So if you don't have any, so a good use case has to have all these three elements. But then the next question is, okay, what makes a good first blockchain use case? And this is, again, you start small, look for the low-hanging fruit, you look for the minimum viable ecosystem. So look for small business network. You don't need all your partners or suppliers to be on blockchain. You just need the key ones there who are more innovative in nature, and to get them on board on your network. You want limited scope. Again, minimum viable product. You're looking at something that you can easily do. And again, keep in mind that the decision that you make on this journey that I was talking about earlier, for example, selecting a platform, is quite likely that, let's say you do the initial POC, maybe you do the pilot, and then decide that, oh, you know what, I need to change my blockchain platform because things are still evolving. You might realize your privacy requirement is much more stringent than what you thought. Or you might realize your business network size eventually is going to be much bigger. Maybe there's some public component in the network that you need to add. So you need a platform that can handle bigger networks. So be aware that it's a little bit of an iterative process. My personal opinion is that there's going to be lots of companies who are going to be going in that journey, POC and pilot, in the next 5 years, and the actual maturity potentially where it becomes like the currently web, it is, I think it's 5 to 6 years down the line. But on the path, there's going to be lots of innovation that's going to happen, and there's going to be a lot of innovative companies who are going to be starting now and going to see those benefits and become more, start evolving their business networks as they go forward. In today's world, with the product life cycles between short, it's very hard to use a follower business strategy, which I think was viable. There was, you had both kind of companies earlier, where some who were really, really innovative, and then some companies who were really, really good at cost efficiency. Nowadays, cost efficiency is almost a given, and it's the innovativeness that's the distinguishing factor. So again, I'm not a business strategist, but my personal opinion that it's very risky not to do anything right now, even knowing that there are still innovations going on in blockchain. Now, I would like to end this webinar with few other things that you need to think about whenever you're going on this journey. And the top of the list is governance and consensus. I think I mentioned it again. It's going to be an ecosystem, and it is very hard to do this collaborative conversation, getting different companies on the board, having them share information. So you have to have a use case that is a win-win, but it takes time. It takes time for people to agree. People to agree on, okay, who will have the rights to invite other members, who will be able to make changes to the smart contract, what would be the rules be of that smart contract. And these are some of the hard things that you need to work through, especially if you're looking at a consortium blockchain networks. And that's the reason these consortium blockchain networks have been taking a while, for even like though R3 consortium has been going on for years now, it's now getting that traction. It's now reaching a stage where people are agreeing to some of those rules and the governance. You have less of that in a private blockchain, but if you're in a consortium or bigger, that will be your biggest hurdle, and you think about that governance and consensus. The other thing to think about is, I did mention in the context of Walmart use case where you have this notion of direct participant versus indirect participant. So there is a cost involved being a direct participant, because then you are going to be running your own blockchain servers or nodes. And at the same time, you have the advantage of having your own control, copy of your own ledger, rather than just depending on APIs. You also have to keep in mind what your privacy requirements are. There are, of course, trade-offs there. So like if you look at Hyperledger Fabric, which is one of the blockchain platform, there is a concept of channels that allows you to have privacy between the participants, but you need to be aware, okay, how many channels would I need? Because there are some performance issues with high number of channels. There are maintenance issues with high number of channels. So you need to be aware of your privacy and where that balance is going to be. You also need to be aware of the data, the PI. You also need to be aware, for example, with EU, the data protection regulations kicking in May, one of the things in there is the right to forget or right to erase. Now that goes totally contradictory to blockchain concept, where the whole transactions are supposed to be immutable. So if you have that kind of requirement, you know that you cannot put the data onto the blockchain. Or if you are going to put the data onto the blockchain, it has to be encrypted, and so that you can throw away the key if needed later on, but you cannot get rid of that data. But that also goes in, so what data are you going to put onto the blockchain and off blockchain? So that's the other concept of on-chain versus off-chain data, because the more data that you put on blockchain, I mean, apart from that privacy issues that I talked about, there's also performance issue, because since you have this copies of ledger, the data is going to get copied everywhere, and the more data you have, the more processing power goes into it, the more time it takes to reach that consensus. So that's another thing to think about as to, okay, what am I going to really put onto the blockchain and keep off blockchain? And last but not least, blockchain is not a security Pennica by itself. You still have to have the same security considerations that you have currently on the other platform or solution. You still need to worry about the key management. You still need to worry about identity and access management. You still need to secure the servers. You still need to secure the access to the servers. So those things you still have to consider, and don't think that, oh, blockchain somehow is going to solve my problems. With that, let me open up for questions. I already see we have a few.
Yes, so we have gotten lots of questions through the chat window throughout the session. So we'll cover as many as we can with high-level responses from Naveen. And then if you're wanting more detailed responses, just let us know in the chat window, and we'll reach out to you specifically. Also, for any we don't answer, we'll be reaching out to you through email to make sure we address any lasting questions you had. So to kick it off, we got a lot of questions, Naveen, but the first one that came up, we hear that blockchain is secure, and you talked about that a lot during the presentation. If that's the case, why do we hear about so many hacking incidents with cryptocurrency?
Okay, so in today's I didn't talk too much about cryptocurrency and the mining and things like that. So in a public blockchain, as I said, it's anybody can join that network. How it is secured is by two things, by essentially having a consensus algorithm, which is, I mean, simplest put, unpredictable. So essentially, there is no control as to who will end up being the leader, and there is a leadership concept, and in case of, for example, Bitcoin and Ethereum, which has the consensus algorithm of proof of work, essentially anybody can solve that. So keep that in mind, that there is the consensus algorithm, which is different in the public blockchain and in other words. Now, coming back to hack, and that goes back to my last comment that I was making, that blockchain by itself is not a security pennica. So most of those hacks that you hear about, essentially primarily comes in because of the poor key management. There's this notion of wallets where the keys are kept. There is the concept of hot wallet and the cold wallet, and the keys are moved to the hot wallet when they want to do something. And in some of the cases where the hack happened, is the people were able to get into that hot wallet because the keys were kept there too long, as an example. Other cases that you need to be very well aware about is the code or the smart contract that gets written. They get written by humans. So it could have bugs. And these are untrusted, essentially, parties in the blockchain who are essentially writing that code. So there could be a problem because of that code itself. That could cause problem, and that's what happened with the AO attack in Ethereum, where the money got moved to an account where it shouldn't have been moved to. But most of these, and the public blockchains like Ethereum and so on and so forth, essentially end up solving that problem through forking. So they basically stop people from accessing their account, and they are able to retrieve the money to the right people. So the kind of hacks that you hear about is not because of the blockchain security faults, but some of the other areas that you need to be conscious about, like the code as well as the key management. Sorry, a long answer.
Great. Thank you, Naveen. We've also gotten a couple questions about blockchain versus existing technology. So what are the benefits that blockchain is bringing to the table? What are the differences that blockchain is bringing to the table compared to existing technology, like a centralized database?
Right. So centralized database is just one aspect of. So blockchain, of course, is built on existing technologies like cryptography, underlying databases. It also uses messaging to keep the nodes in sync. For example, a Hyperledger, a Fabric, which is one of the open source blockchain platform, uses like Kafka for messaging. So it is essentially built on top of existing technology. So if someone wanted to build something like that from scratch, they can. The unique aspect of it, as I said, is the decentralized control, where it is not just about the fact that how they are put together, how especially in a permission blockchain, how each individual party has its own ledger, has its own certificate authority, has its own key management, and they are still able to interact with the other parties over in that ecosystem. That makes this technology unique, not to mention some of the privacy aspect. There's lots of innovation in that privacy area, like a zero knowledge proof. How do you prove that you are more than 18 years old without disclosing your age, as an example? So those are some of the unique aspects of the blockchain. Now, there are certain problems that could actually easily be solved by the centralized database. But keep in mind, whenever you talk about the centralized database, the question to be asked is, okay, who's going to be owning this? If I have multiple companies, would they agree that I own all of their data? And then if I get hacked, all of them basically lose all the data? So that's the issue that the blockchain tries to solve. And that's the unique aspect of the blockchain.
Great. Thank you, Naveen. And like I said, we're just giving high-level responses based on how much time we have. If anybody who has these questions during the webinar wants more detail, just let us know in the chat window and we'll follow up with you. One of the questions we got, is it possible for a transaction to get lost or fail in the blockchain? If that does happen, how do you get it back?
Yeah, so that depends on the platform. So the idea is, short answer is no, but different platform tries to solve that problem differently. Like in Ethereum world, it is basically each node essentially ends up executing the same transaction. And so the concept is you execute and then order. In case of other platforms, like, again, going back to Hyperledger Fabric, which is one of the more mature permission blockchain platform, it's slightly different. You basically execute, order, and then validate. So there is slightly different, and then in Hyperledger Sawtooth, they actually share the state. And so that's a unique aspect of Hyperledger Sawtooth, that they, instead of just relying on the fact that if everybody executed the same transaction, they are going to end up with the same state, it basically tries to sync the state itself. It keeps the state as a Merkle tree and then tries to make sure that the hash on all the participants is the same. So, technology basically enforces that the transaction is not lost, and but different mechanisms.
Great. Thank you, Naveen. How do you securely view medical information, for example, using blockchain? Is it possible to selectively share certain information? How does that work?
Yeah, there are actually a couple of ICOs, a couple of different ways to solve the problem. One of them, the ICO from UK, they essentially, they're, again, here we are talking about putting the EMR information onto the blockchain or off blockchain, but somehow managed by blockchain, which, as I mentioned earlier, does have interoperability issues as to how would everybody agree. But keeping that aside, the idea there is that you use symmetric keys. So you basically encrypt the data with all the keys of all the people who are allowed to view the data. So in that case, any one of them can decrypt it using their keys. So that's one mechanism of making sure that only those who are approved to see the data, so when that approval happens, the data gets encrypted by that person's key, and so that that person can decrypt it. Of course, it gets a little tricky when you want to remove the access, because in that case, it has to be decrypted by all the keys and re-encrypted by, so if I have 7 people and I'm taking one out, I basically decrypt it and then re-encrypt it with the 6 keys and put it out there. So that's one mechanism to make sure that only the people who have the consent of the patient and thereby approved can see the data.
Great. Thank you, Naveen. We have time for really just one more question. It looks like since we're coming up on top of the hour. We've gotten a couple questions on different tools and platforms, the different tools and platforms that are in the blockchain landscape. Could you just at a high level touch on where you see the most potential in the scope of blockchain tools?
So I'm assuming that the question is more about platform than tools, there is a slight distinction.
Yes.
Assuming it is about platform, as I said, they typically will fall into two categories. They will fall into the public blockchain space or in the permission blockchain space. In the permission blockchain, the most mature at this point, or the three, I would say, or actually four, as I mentioned in that Project Ubin case studies, the three that they looked at is Ricarda, which is primarily focused on financial services. Then you also have Quorum, which is actually built on top of Ethereum. So basically, it forked the Ethereum code and added some privacy things, and their main objective was to somehow have a solution that can be used for both public as well as private. And the third one is Hyperledger Fabric, which is an open source driven by Linux Foundation. Lots of traction on Hyperledger Fabric. Already had its 1.0 release, so it is decently mature. It then had its 1.1, and currently they are working on 1.2. The other one, again, another Linux Foundation Hyperledger project, which I mentioned, is Hyperledger Sawtooth. There are some differences between, though both are in permission. As I said, the technology is different, and how they do consensus is different between Hyperledger Fabric and Sawtooth. One is slightly better than the other in terms of the size of the network. And so there are some performances that are different between the two. In the public, of course, then we get into the cryptocurrencies, and that one, again, that's where there's a lot of hype. I'm not saying that it's not going to happen, that in other words, we are not going to have digital currency or any such thing, but I personally believe that it will be driven more by the central banks rather than a public currency. Having said that, there is place for that across countries. So even if each country ends up with its own digital currency, you still have to talk about, okay, how does the cross-border transactions happen? And that's where you get into these currencies like Ripple and Stellar, which I think has some value in that space.
Great. Thank you, Naveen. And we are out of time at the top of the hour. Please take a look at some of our presence online. If you go to the Perficient.com website and click on the Insights tab, we have lots of great blogs, white papers, and upcoming webinars out there, some of which are from Naveen, who is our speaker today. And we do have 2 upcoming blockchain events in Indianapolis and Denver. So the bit.ly links are here. We'll also be sending out these slides in the recording after the session, so that you have access to all of this information. And as for that, thank you so much for joining us today, and have a